The screech of tires ripped through the rain-soaked streets as a sleek black sedan spun out of control, slamming into a concrete barrier with a metallic grind. A heartbeat of silence hung over the chaos, then the driver's door burst open, and a man tumbled onto the asphalt, his white shirt soaked in blood, the powerful aura of a king reduced to a staggering vulnerable heap. Neon signs flickered against the rain-slicked pavement, their colors bleeding into the oily puddles that lined the city streets. Sonia James shifted the heavy strap of her bag, her shoulders aching from hours of carrying trays and dodging the tempers of impatient customers. Her shoes squelched with each step, the fatigue of her late-night shift weighing her down, and the city hummed around her in indifferent rhythm. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Then chaos shattered the monotony. Tires screamed across the slick asphalt, metal screeched against concrete, and a black sedan skidded to a bone-jarring stop. From the blur of panic, a figure tumbled onto the wet street, blood streaking his crisp white shirt, the aura of power he carried reduced to a staggering vulnerable heap. Passers-by froze then fled, leaving Sonia staring, heart pounding at the fallen man. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees beside him, rain soaking her hair, realizing she was the only one who hadn't turned away. The siren's wail outside was a distant, jagged blade, cutting through the heavy silence of Sonia's third-floor walk-up. Inside, the only sound was the wet, ragged rhythm of Minsu's breathing. Sonia had locked the deadbolt and pushed her heavy oak dresser in front of the door, her hands still shaking so violently she could barely grip the wood. She guided Minsu to the kitchen floor, the linoleum cold against his skin. He slumped against the base of her cabinets, his movements clumsy and heavy, like a titan made of lead. The rugged elegance he had carried moments ago in the street was gone, replaced by the raw, visceral reality of a man bleeding out. His white shirt was no longer white. It was a map of violence, the silk clinging to a jagged entry wound just below his ribs. "Keep your eyes on me," Sonia whispered, her voice a fragile tether in the dim light of the single bulb overhead. "Minsu, look at me." He raised his head, and for a heartbeat, the Mafia boss flickered back into existence. Even through the haze of shock, his dark eyes held a terrifying, quiet resolve, a dangerous glint that suggested he was already calculating how to kill the men who had done this to him. But then, a spasm of pain tore through him, and his head lolled back against the cabinet with a dull thud. He was vulnerable, a king stripped of his crown, hiding in a kitchen that smelled of pine cleaner and cheap coffee. Sonia moved with a frantic, focused grace. She tore through her linen closet, grabbing every clean towel she owned and a bottle of high-proof whiskey she'd kept for a rainy day. This wasn't the kind of rain she had expected. As she knelt beside him, the contrast was stark. Her hands, calloused from years of service and hardened by her own survival, against his pale, blood-slicked skin. "This is going to hurt," she murmured. Minsu's hand shot out, his fingers locking around her wrist with surprising strength. His grip was a warning, a reflex of a man who had spent his life expecting betrayal. Sonia didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a steady, protective urgency that seemed to startle him. Slowly, the tension left his fingers and he released her, a silent permission granted. As she cleaned the wound, the air in the apartment grew stifling. Every creak of the floorboards above, every car door slamming in the alleyway below, made her heart hammer against her ribs. She knew the city was being combed. Men in dark suits and darker intentions were likely moving through the streets of Koreatown, looking for the man currently bleeding on her floor. Minsu let out a low guttural groan as the alcohol hit the wound. "Why?" he rasped, the word barely a breath. Everyone else ran. Sonia didn't look up as she applied pressure with a thick towel. "I've spent my whole life running from things that go bump in the night, Minsu. At some point you just get tired of it." She glanced at him then, her eyes softening. "Besides, I saw the way you looked at the car before it hit. You weren't afraid of dying. You were afraid of being left behind. I know that look." A shadow of a smile, or perhaps a grimace of pain, touched his lips. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like a vacuum of fear, but a bridge. Outside, a black SUV crawled slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping across the brickwork of her building like a searchlight. Sonia froze, her breath catching in her throat, her hand still pressed firmly against Minsu's side. They sat there in the shadows of the small kitchen, the waitress who had seen too much and the boss who had lost everything, waiting for the hunters to pass, bound together by a single act of mercy in a city that had none. The storm outside had settled into a rhythmic, melancholic drumming against the window pane, a stark contrast to the electric tension hummed within the small apartment. Minsu was now propped up against a stack of mismatched pillows on Sonia's thrifted sofa, his pale face ghostly under the warm glow of a floor lamp. The immediate danger of the wound had passed, but a different kind of vulnerability had taken its place, the silence of two people who had spent their lives building walls, now forced to look at the cracks. Sonia sat on a low stool across from him, her hands finally still as she watched him. She noticed the way he looked at her small space, the framed photos of her mother, the stack of library books on the coffee table, the African violet struggling to bloom on the windowsill. He didn't look at it with the disdain of a rich man, but with the quiet longing of someone who had forgotten what a home felt like. "The shirt is ruined," Minsu said suddenly, his voice raspy and stripped of its usual authority. He looked down at the torn silk, then at his own forearm, where a long jagged scar peeked out from beneath the cuff. It wasn't from a bullet, it was old, raised and white. Sonia's eyes drifted to the mark. Without thinking, she reached out, then hesitated, her fingers hovering in the air. That wasn't from tonight. Minsu looked at the scar, his expression darkening. "A reminder," he murmured, "from a father who thought fear was the only way to teach loyalty. He called it a legacy. I call it a cage." He looked up, his dark eyes searching hers. "And you? You don't move like someone who is afraid of the dark. You move like someone who has lived in it." Sonia pulled back, her hand instinctively going to her own shoulder, hidden beneath the fabric of her damp uniform. She felt the phantom itch of the burn mark she carried there. A gift from a man who had claimed to love her until the day he showed her his true face. For a long moment, she debated the safety of the truth. But in this dim room, with the world hunting the man on her couch, the truth was the only currency they had left. She slowly shifted her collar, revealing the edge of the mottled skin on her shoulder. "He didn't use fear to teach loyalty," she said quietly. "He used it to keep me small. I thought if I worked enough double shifts, if I made myself invisible, I could disappear before he found me again." Minsu's gaze softened, a look of profound recognition crossing his features. In that moment, the gap between the Korean Mafia boss and the black waitress vanished. They were simply two survivors recognizing the same dialect of pain. "We are both hiding from ghosts, it seems," Minsu said, reaching out a hand, palm up on the cushion between them. "Different names, different cities, but the same shadows." Sonia placed her hand in his. His skin was hot with a lingering fever, his grip steady despite his weakness. It wasn't a romantic gesture but a pact, a silent agreement that for tonight, within these four walls, the ghosts couldn't reach them. "My father died believing I was a monster," Minsu whispered, his thumb grazing the back of her hand. "I spent years trying to prove him right because I didn't know how to be anything else. But tonight, when everyone else ran, you looked at me and saw a man." Sonia squeezed his hand, her heart aching with a sudden fierce protectiveness. "Maybe that's because you are one, Minsu. The monsters are the ones still out there in the rain. Here, you're just someone who needs to heal." They sat in the quiet of the apartment, the language of their shared scars finally spoken. The secret of their pasts had become a bridge, and as Minsu's eyes finally drifted shut in a much-needed sleep, Sonia remained on her stool, keeping watch over the first person who had truly looked at her in years. The fragile peace of the morning was shattered by a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards of the apartment. It wasn't the rattling of the nearby elevated train, or the usual rumble of a delivery truck. This was the synchronized growl of heavy engines idling in the narrow street below. Sonia, who had been nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, felt the hair on her arm stand up before she even reached the window. Peering through the cracked blinds, She saw 3 pristine charcoal gray SUVs lined up like predators along the curb. The neighborhood residents, usually loud and bustling, had vanished into their doorways, sensing the arrival of something unnatural. The doors of the lead vehicle opened in perfect unison, and 4 men stepped out. They didn't look like the street thugs Sonia had spent her life avoiding. They wore suits that cost more than she made in a year, their faces masks of cold, professional iron. "They're here," she whispered, the coffee cup clattering as she set it on the counter. Min-soo, whose fever had broken during the night, tried to push himself upright. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his teeth, his hand clutching the fresh bandages on his side. "The dresser, Sonia," he commanded, his voice regaining that terrifying edge of authority. "Move it. Now." Sonia didn't hesitate. She threw her weight against the oak dresser, the wood groaning against the floorboards as she cleared the path. A moment later, a sharp rhythmic knock echoed through the door. Not a plea for entry, but a signal of arrival. When she swung the door open, the hallway felt suddenly cramped, occupied by a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver lapel pin and eyes that scanned the room with the efficiency of a weapon. "Boss," the man said, bowing deeply at the waist. He didn't look at Sonia. To him, she was part of the furniture. "Franco," Min-soo rasped, nodding toward the newcomer. "Status. The Donados have blocked the main routes into Koreatown. They know you survived the alley, but they don't know where you are. Yet." Franco's gaze finally flickered to Sonia, and for a second, she felt a chill that went straight to her marrow. It was a look of cold assessment, calculating whether she was a witness to be protected or a loose end to be tied. As the other men filed into her small living room, the space transformed. Her home, her sanctuary, was suddenly an outpost in a war zone. One man began sweeping the walls with an electronic device, checking for bugs, while another stood by the window with a hand hovering near the holster beneath his jacket. The gilded threat had arrived. This wasn't just a neighborhood scuffle or a disgruntled ex-husband. This was a machine of power and violence that spanned continents. Sonia watched as Franco leaned down to whisper to Min-soo, showing him a tablet with satellite maps and encrypted feeds. She realized then that by dragging Min-soo across her threshold, she hadn't just saved a man. She had stepped into the gears of a massive lethal engine. The casual clothes she wore felt like paper armor against the polished, lethal reality of these men. Min-soo looked up, catching her eye amidst the flurry of activity. He saw the realization dawning on her face, the sheer scale of the danger she had invited into her life. He reached out, his fingers brushing the hem of her apron. "Sonia," he said, his voice dropping an octave meant only for her. "They are here to protect me. But because of me, you are now the most hunted woman in this city. There is no going back to the diner." Sonia looked at the men in their silent, expensive suits, then back at the bloodstains still drying on her kitchen linoleum. The bus stops, the double shifts, and the quiet anonymity of her life had evaporated. She was no longer just a waitress who didn't run. She was a target in a game where the losers didn't just lose their jobs, they lost their lives. The heavy metallic tension of the morning had gradually settled into a strange domestic stillness. Franco and his men had retreated to the perimeter, their presence marked only by the occasional low murmur of a radio in the hallway and the shadow of a guard passing the kitchen window. Inside the apartment, the air smelled of sesame oil and scorched garlic, a scent that anchored the high-stakes chaos to the simple reality of a meal. Sonia moved around her small stove with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple bowl of juk and a side of sautéed greens. She placed the steaming bowl in front of Min-soo, who was now sitting at her small, circular wooden table. His presence seemed to dwarf the furniture, his expensive blood-cleansed watch catching the light as he picked up a spoon. "It isn't the 5-course spreads you're used to," Sonia said, taking the seat across from him. She watched him carefully, looking for any sign of the cold commander who had been barking orders at Franco an hour ago. Min-soo took a slow, deliberate bite, the warmth of the food seemingly bringing the color back to his hollowed cheeks. "It is the first meal I haven't had to have tested for poison in 3 years," he replied quietly. He looked at her, his gaze intense but no longer predatory. In my world, luxury is a mask for paranoia. This is a luxury I haven't known since I was a boy. Sonia leaned back, her fingers tracing a deep scratch in the wood of the table. I used to think people like you had everything. Total control. No one to answer to. Minsu let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any mirth. Control is an illusion, Sonia. I am a prisoner of a legacy I didn't choose. Every move I make is dictated by the moves of my enemies and the expectations of my allies. I am the warlord of a kingdom built on shifting sand. He paused, looking out at the skyline where the sun was beginning to dip behind the skyscrapers. I spent my life trying to be the man my father wanted. But sitting here in a kitchen that smells like peace, I find myself wondering what the man I want to be would look like. He'd look like someone who doesn't need an army to feel safe, Sonia offered, her voice soft but firm. Minsu reached across the table, his hand hesitant before he covered hers. His skin was warm, his touch grounding. I've spent so long looking through the scope of a rifle or the terms of a contract. I never imagined a future that didn't involve a throne or a grave. But you didn't run. You looked at a dying man and saw a person. It makes me believe there is a version of my life where I don't have to be the monster. There's always a choice, Minsu, she said, her heart fluttering at the contact. Even for someone like you. You could take that power and turn it into something that builds instead of breaks. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips, not the smirk of a boss, but the weary hope of a survivor. For a few fleeting moments, the waitress and the warlord vanished. There were no syndicates, no sirens, and no looming threats. There was only the steam rising from the bowls and the quiet conversation of two people, beginning to dream of a world that didn't require them to hide. If I ever find that world, Minsu whispered, his eyes locked onto hers, I want to make sure you're there to see it. Not as a woman I owe a debt to, but as the woman who showed me the way out. The piece was fragile, a glass ornament held in a trembling hand, but for that hour it was theirs. They shared the meal in a comfortable silence, a pact forming between them that went far deeper than protection or gratitude. It was the first time either of them had allowed themselves to look past the next hour and toward a horizon that wasn't on fire. The fragile domesticity of the kitchen evaporated with the sudden sharp pop of a suppressed round shattering the living room window. The glass didn't just break. It disintegrated into 1,000 shimmering diamonds that sprayed across the hardwood floor. Before the sound had even registered in Sonia's mind, Minsu had surged across the small space, his injured side forgotten as he tackled her to the floor. Down! Stay down! He hissed, his body a heavy protective shield over hers. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Then came the heavy rhythmic thud of a battering ram against the apartment door. The oak dresser Sonia had moved earlier groaned and splintered, the wood screaming under the pressure. Franco and his men were already engaging, the muffled staccato of gunfire erupting in the hallway, but it was clear from the shouting in Italian and Korean that they were being flanked. They found us, Sonia breathed, the cold realization anchoring her to the floor. How did they find us? It doesn't matter now, Minsu said, his face a mask of lethal focus. He reached into the waistband of his trousers, pulling a sleek, dark handgun from where he'd hidden it beneath his sweater. He looked at her, his eyes intense. Sonia, look at me. The fire escape. Can you get to it? It's through the bedroom, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Go. Now. I'm right behind you. They crawled through the hallway, staying beneath the line of fire as bullets chewed through the plaster walls, sending clouds of white dust into the air. Sonia's sanctuary was being shredded, her memories and photographs caught in the crossfire of a war she hadn't started. She reached the bedroom window and wrenched it open, the cold night air rushing in to meet the heat of the chaos. The iron stairs of the fire escape were slick with renewed rain. Sonia scrambled down, her hands burning against the freezing metal, while Minsu followed with a grimace of agony, his bandages already blooming with fresh crimson. Below them, the alley was a labyrinth of shadows. This way, Sonia urged, her knowledge of the neighborhood becoming their only lifeline. She led him through a gap in a chain-link fence and into the service tunnel of a nearby laundromat she'd worked at years ago. Behind them, the apartment building erupted. A flash of orange light signaled a grenade or a breach charge, blowing out the third-story windows. The home Sonia had worked 3 years to afford was gone in a pillar of smoke. She didn't have time to mourn. She could hear the screech of tires on the main road, the rival gang's scouts circling the block like vultures. They moved through the city's underbelly, dodging between dumpsters and slipping into the steam-filled vents of the industrial district. Every shadow looked like a hitman. Every distant siren sounded like a death knell. Min-soo leaned heavily on her, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, but his hand never left his weapon. "We can't go to the main roads," Sonia whispered as they crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets. "They'll have cameras. They'll have eyes everywhere." "You're right," Min-soo rasped, his forehead beaded with cold sweat. "We go to the docks. I have a secondary contact there. But we have to cross the bridge." Sonia looked at the bridge in the distance, illuminated by the cold, uncaring lights of the city. It was a bottleneck, a trap. But looking at Min-soo's pale face and the determination in his eyes, she knew there was no other choice. The first breach had stripped away their safety, leaving them with nothing but the rain, the darkness, and each other. The waitress and the warlord were no longer hiding. They were running for their lives through a city that had turned into a graveyard. The industrial skeleton of the docks loomed over them, a forest of rusted cranes and stacked shipping containers that whistled in the freezing wind. Min-soo's contact had directed them to a derelict warehouse at the end of Pier 47, a place where the air tasted of salt, diesel, and rot. Inside, the safe house was nothing more than a hollowed-out office on the second floor, furnished with a single cot, a propane heater that hissed like a snake, and a flickering bulb that struggled against the encroaching dark. Sonia helped Min-soo onto the cot, her own muscles screaming with fatigue. She moved to the window, watching the play of headlights across the water. The city lights seemed miles away now, a distant world they no longer belonged to. When she turned back, she found Min-soo watching her, his face etched with a profound, heavy guilt that looked more painful than the wound in his side. "Franco will be here within the hour," Min-soo said, his voice a low gravelly rasp. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, held together by a rubber band. He laid it on the edge of the cot. "There is enough here to get you to the coast. New identity, a clean start. Franco has a car waiting 3 blocks north." Sonia looked at the money, then back at him. The silence in the room stretched, filled only by the rhythmic ticking of the cooling heater. "What are you doing, Min-soo?" "I am giving you your life back," he said, his eyes darkening. "Look at what happened tonight, Sonia. Your home is gone. Your peace is shattered. If you stay with me, the next breach won't just take your furniture. It will take your breath. This war. It is an inheritance of blood. You don't deserve to be part of the debt." Sonia walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't look at the envelope. She looked at the man who had protected her with his own body when the glass shattered. "You think I stayed because I didn't have anywhere else to go? I stayed because for the first time in years, I saw someone who was more than just a victim or a shadow. I saw a man who wanted to be better. I am a warlord, Sonia," he reminded her, his voice rising with a desperate edge. "The men hunting me don't care about your kindness. They will use you to get to me, and they will break you just to hear me scream." "Then let them try," Sonia replied, her voice dropping to a whisper of pure, unyielding iron. She knelt beside the cot, placing her hand over his. "You told me you wanted to see a world where you weren't a monster. You think you can find that world alone? You think you can build something new while you're still bleeding from the old?" Min-soo's fingers curled around hers, his grip tight enough to bruise. "You're a fool if you stay." "Then I'm a fool," she said, a small sad smile touching her lips. "But I'm a fool who isn't running. You've spent your life surrounded by people who are paid to be loyal. Try having someone stay because they choose to." The warlord looked at the waitress, and for the first time, the power dynamic shifted entirely. He wasn't the boss and she wasn't the servant. They were two people on the edge of an abyss, and she was the only thing keeping him from falling. Minsu pulled her hand to his chest, his eyes closing as he leaned his forehead against hers. "If you stay," he whispered into the darkness, "there is no going back. The woman you were yesterday, she's gone." "She was tired of her anyway," Sonia whispered back. She didn't move. She stayed in the cold, salt-stained room, choosing the danger of the man over the safety of the world, anchoring them both to a future that was still being written in the shadows. The warehouse was a cavern of rusted metal and deep, shifting shadows, but the silence was the most dangerous thing about it. Franco had arrived with a skeletal crew, their faces tight with the knowledge that they were being hunted in their own city. The air was thick with the scent of old grease and the looming storm. Sonia sat on a wooden crate near Minsu's cot, her eyes tracking the movement of a single moth circling the dim overhead light. "They're too quiet," Minsu murmured, his hand hovering over the grip of his pistol. His fever had settled into a cold, sharp alertness. "Franco, report." The radio crackled with static, then a panicked voice tore through the stillness. "Ambush." They were waiting in the shipping yard. The transmission ended in a sharp, percussive blast that shook the warehouse walls. The windows along the upper catwalk shattered inward as a hail of gunfire erupted from the darkness outside. It wasn't a skirmish, it was an execution attempt. Franco's men were cut down in the first few seconds, the sounds of the struggle muffled by the heavy iron doors. The rival syndicate had followed the blood trail of Minsu's loyalists straight to their sanctuary. "Sonia, get behind the steel desk," Minsu roared, dragging himself off the cot despite the agony lacing through his side. He managed to fire 3 rounds toward the catwalk, pinning down a shooter, but his strength was flagging. His face was a mask of gray exhaustion, the fresh bandages on his ribs already soaked through. As a second wave of attackers kicked in the side door, Minsu's gun clicked empty. He reached for a spare magazine, but his trembling fingers betrayed him, the metal sliding across the floor and disappearing into a drainage grate. A shadow loomed in the doorway, a man in a dark tactical vest, leveling a shotgun toward the slumped form of the warlord. In that heartbeat, the waitress who had spent her life avoiding conflict vanished. Sonia didn't think about the odds or the caliber of the weapons. She only saw the man who had sheltered her body with his own when the glass first broke. With a primal cry, she lunged from behind the desk. She didn't have a gun, but she had the heavy, iron-bound propane heater they had been using for warmth. She swung the tank with every ounce of the strength she had gained from years of carrying heavy trays and surviving the streets. The heavy metal base connected with the attacker's temple with a sickening crack, sending him sprawling. Before his partner could react, Sonia scooped up the fallen shotgun. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were locked in a fierce, unwavering determination. She didn't know how to be a soldier, but she knew how to protect what was hers. As the next man stepped into the light, she pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, bruising her skin, but the blast forced the attackers back into the rain. "Minsu! The stairs!" she screamed, her voice sounding like a stranger's in her own ears. She grabbed him under the arm, hauling his weight upward as bullets chewed the wooden floorboards beneath their heels. She was the anchor now, the fierce lioness guarding a wounded king. Every time a shadow moved, she fired, the flashes of light illuminating her face. A mask of sweat, soot, and an iron will that no Mafia training could instill. They reached the heavy industrial lift at the back of the building. Sonia shoved Minsu inside and slammed the gate shut just as a bullet grazed her forearm. She didn't even flinch. She hit the lever, and as the lift began its slow, grinding ascent, she stood at the gate, the shotgun leveled at the darkness below. Minsu looked up at her from the floor of the lift, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He saw the blood on her sleeve and the fire in her gaze. He had spent his life surrounded by killers, but he had never seen a courage as pure or as terrifying as the woman standing over him. In the roar of the shootout, she had found her power, and she had used it to drag them both back from the lip of the grave. The rooftop of the industrial complex was whipped by a relentless wind, the city lights below flickering like dying embers. Minsu leaned heavily against the parapet, his silhouette sharp against the gray sky. Franco stood a few paces behind him, a tablet in his hand and a look of profound disbelief on his face. Sonia was there too, wrapped in a heavy wool coat Minsu had insisted she wear, the shotgun she had used to save them now leaning against a crate, a silent testament to the line she had crossed. "You are certain, boss?" Franco's voice was barely audible over the gale. "To release these files. It is the end. Not just for the Donatos but for us. The Costello Alliance, the ports, the offshore holdings, it all goes into the hands of the federal authorities. There is no coming back from this. You will be a man without a kingdom." Minsu turned slowly, his gaze drifting to Sonia. He saw the bruise on her shoulder and the exhaustion in her eyes, but most of all, he saw the unwavering light of a woman who had offered him mercy when he was nothing but a broken body in the rain. He looked back at Franco, his expression settling into a cold, absolute clarity. "I have spent my life wearing a crown made of thorns and lead," Minsu said, his voice ringing with the newfound freedom. "Every brick of that empire was laid with fear. And look where it brought us. It brought the fire to the doorstep of the only person who ever saw me as a human being. If I keep the crown, I keep the target on her back. I will not let her pay for my father's sins." "They will call it a betrayal," Franco warned. "Let them," Minsu replied. "It is an evolution. Send the encrypted drive to the Attorney General's office. Every name, every ledger, every route. By sunrise, the Donato family will be a memory, and the Korean syndicate will be dismantled from the inside out. I am trading a throne for a life." Sonia walked toward him, the wind catching her hair. She reached out, her fingers lacing with his. "Minsu, you don't have to do this for me. We could keep running." "No," he said, pulling her hand to his lips. "I am done running, and I am done fighting wars for ghosts. This isn't just for you, Sonia. It's for the man you saw in that kitchen. He doesn't want an empire. He just wants to wake up in a world where you don't have to hold a weapon." Franco hesitated for a single heartbeat, then tapped a final sequence into the tablet. A soft chime signaled the transmission of decades of secrets into the hands of the law. The lion had effectively pulled his own teeth, sacrificing his immunity and his immense wealth to ensure that the hunt would finally end. The weight of the silence that followed was massive. The digital collapse of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise happened in a fraction of a second, leaving Minsu standing there. No longer a warlord, no longer a boss but a man. He felt the phantom pressure of the crown lift from his brow, replaced by the simple grounding heat of Sonia's hand in his. "It's done," Minsu whispered, watching the first light of dawn begin to bleed over the horizon. "The empire is gone." Sonia leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart finally finding a steady rhythm. The gilded threat had been neutralized by the very man who created it. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, this time coming for the enemies he had exposed, Minsu didn't reach for a gun. He simply held on tighter to the woman who had stayed, knowing that while he had lost a kingdom, he had finally found a home. The skyline of a different city, 1 mile away from the jagged shadows of their past, glowed under the soft, amber hues of a rising sun. The air here didn't taste of salt and diesel. It tasted of pine, fresh earth, and the quiet promise of a morning where no one had to check the perimeter before pouring a cup of coffee. Sonia stood on the porch of a modest, light-filled house that overlooked a valley of rolling green. She watched the light catch the windows, a stark contrast to the neon-stained glass of her old apartment. Behind her, the front door creaked open and Minsu stepped out. He moved slowly, his gait still favoring his side, but the cane he carried was a symbol of survival rather than defeat. He wasn't wearing a silk suit or a blood-stained shirt. He wore a simple linen button-down, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars that no longer felt like a cage. The transition hadn't been easy. The months following the collapse of the syndicates were filled with depositions, hidden transitions, and the slow, grueling process of turning a warlord's resources into a foundation for rehabilitation. But as the legal dust settled, the new sun they had dreamed of in the warehouse finally began to crest the horizon. "The community center called," Minsu said, his voice now clear and steady, devoid of the gravelly rasp of the dying man she had found in the rain. The first group of youth counselors starts their training on Monday. They're calling it the James Foundation. Sonia smiled, leaning back against the porch railing. You really went through with it. You turned the Costello holdings into a legacy of help. It was never my money to keep, Sonia, Minsu replied, stepping closer until he stood beside her. He looked out at the valley, his eyes reflecting the peaceful stillness of a life lived in the light. I spent 30 years breaking things. I'd like to spend the rest of my life seeing if I can fix a few. He reached out, his hand finding hers. The contact was no longer a desperate pact made in the dark. It was a gentle, everyday anchor. He was no longer the man who had collapsed in public, and she was no longer the woman who was just a face in a crowded diner. They had become something entirely new, a family built not on bloodlines or business, but on the radical act of staying when everyone else ran. Do you miss it? Sonia asked quietly. The power? The way people looked at you when you walked into a room. Minsu turned to her, his gaze softening with a warmth that made the morning sun seem dim. I used to think power was the ability to make people kneel. I was wrong. True power is the ability to walk away from a throne and still feel like a king because of the woman standing next to me. He pulled her into a slow, careful embrace. There were no sirens in the distance, no screeching tires, and no shadows lurking in the trees. There was only the sound of the wind through the pines and the steady, rhythmic beating of two hearts that had survived the impossible. As they stood together, watching the new day fully reveal the world around them, Sonia realized that her protective shield was no longer a liability. It was the foundation of their new life. They had traded a kingdom of fear for a home built one act of kindness at a time. The waitress and the warlord had finally found their way out of the rain, stepping together into the warmth of a sun that would never have to set on their past again. If this story made you feel something, please like the video and subscribe to this channel for more.